It wasn't the biting wind that made the seasoned geologist shiver. It was the absurdity. Clarence King, a man who had charted mountains and stared into the volcanic throats of the earth, stood on a desolate mesa in the far northwestern corner of Colorado, a place the Utes called the Vermilion Cliffs and white men called nowhere. He knelt, his fingers brushing away the thin, cold soil from a small anthill. There, glinting with a dull, malevolent light, was a diamond. Not a pebble, but a rough, uncut stone of genuine size. Around him, his men were finding more. Rubies, too, dozens of them. It was the stuff of fantasy, a discovery that would rewrite the destiny of the United States, a treasure hoard to dwarf the California gold rush. And in that moment, under the vast, unforgiving sky of the American West in the winter of 1872, Clarence King felt a cold dread creep into his soul, because he knew, with the certainty of a man who understood the very bones of the continent, that it was all a lie. The diamonds, the rubies, the anthills, none of it should be here. It was a fraud so immense, so audacious, that it had already ensnared some of the most powerful men in America, from the banking halls of San Francisco to the gilded offices of Tiffany & Co. in New York. The shiver came not from the cold, but from the chilling realization that he was standing at the heart of the greatest hoax in American history. And the truth, like the landscape around him, was brutal, unforgiving, and buried just beneath a glittering, treacherous surface. The story of that lie began not in the corridors of power, but in the dusty, defeated landscape of post-Civil War Kentucky, with two cousins who had learned the hard way that honest work was a slow and often fruitless path to fortune. Philip Arnold was the brain, a man whose ambition was as vast and unyielding as the Kentucky hills he hailed from. He had a restless energy, a quick mind that saw angles and opportunities where others saw only hardship. He had served in the Confederate Army, a fact he rarely spoke of, but which had instilled in him a certain ruthlessness and a deep-seated cynicism about the established order. He had seen men of supposed honor and breeding reduced to desperation, and men of low cunning rise to power. The war had taught him that the line between respectability and ruin was thinner than a razor's edge, and fortune, true fortune, favored not the righteous, but the bold. After the war, he had drifted, working as a hatter, a prospector, and a clerk, each job chafing against his desire for something more, for a life that didn't involve scraping by on another man's wages. His eyes, a pale and piercing blue, seemed to be constantly calculating, weighing the worth of men and the angles of a deal. His cousin, John Slack, was a different creature altogether. Where Arnold was sharp and calculating, Slack was stolid, earthy, and unassuming. He was a man you would forget moments after meeting him, his face a bland canvas of mediocrity. He lacked Arnold's intellectual fire, but possessed a plodding persistence that was, in its own way, just as formidable. He was the kind of man who could endure hardship without complaint, who could follow a plan with unwavering loyalty, not because he fully grasped its intricacies, but because he trusted the man who had devised it. He had followed Arnold to Mexico on a prospecting venture that had yielded little more than dust and disappointment. He had seen his cousin's frustration fester, had listened to his late-night tirades against a world that seemed designed to keep good men down. Slack didn't dream of empires, or of bringing financial titans to their knees. He dreamed of a comfortable farm, a bit of land to call his own, and an end to the ceaseless struggle for survival. He was the perfect instrument for Arnold's grand design, loyal, unquestioning, and utterly believable in his simplicity. The seed of the idea was planted in 1870 during a trip to London that Arnold had financed through some minor, forgotten speculation. There, he had witnessed firsthand the burgeoning diamond trade. He saw the fortunes being made from the newly discovered mines in South Africa, the way a handful of rough stones could command more wealth than 1,000 acres of prime Kentucky farmland. He visited the workshops of Amsterdam, where he learned a crucial piece of information. Industrial-grade diamonds, the cast-offs and refuse from the gem-cutting process known as bort, could be purchased for a pittance. They were real diamonds, chemically identical to their flawless cousins, but considered commercially worthless for jewelry. To a man who understood the geology of the American West, who had spent years searching for gold and silver, this knowledge sparked a fire. Gold and silver had to be found, painstakingly wrested from the earth. But what if a diamond field didn't need to be found? What if it could be created? Back in America, Arnold sought out Slack. He found him in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, his shoulders stooped from another failed venture. Over cheap whiskey in a smoky tavern, Arnold laid out the skeleton of his plan. It was a plan born of resentment and genius, a scheme that preyed upon the very soul of Gilded Age America, its insatiable greed, its romantic obsession with the untamed frontier, and its naive belief that limitless fortune lay just over the next horizon. The nation was drunk on speculation. Railroads were lacing their way across the continent, financed by audacious promises and mountains of investor capital. Silver strikes in Nevada had created instant millionaires. The stock market was a casino where fortunes were won and lost in the blink of an eye. In this environment, men were primed to believe in the impossible, especially if it promised to make them rich. Arnold's plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and its audacity. They would acquire a large quantity of cheap industrial-grade diamonds and a few other semi-precious stones. Then they would travel to a remote, inaccessible location in the American West, a place so far from civilization that no one would stumble upon it by accident. There, they would salt the earth, scattering their purchased gems in a way that mimicked a natural deposit. Finally, they would make their discovery, and with a few well-chosen stones as proof, approach the financial giants of San Francisco, the hungriest and most daring speculators in the country. They wouldn't ask for a handout. They would play the part of simple, uneducated prospectors overwhelmed by the magnitude of their find and in need of powerful partners to develop it. Their feigned ignorance would be their greatest weapon. Slack listened, his brow furrowed. It sounded like something out of a dime novel. It was dishonest, it was dangerous, and it was brilliant. He thought of his debts, of the endless cycle of labor and poverty. He looked at his cousin, at the burning certainty in his eyes. Arnold wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about a kind of cosmic justice, a way to turn the tables on the very men who sat in their plush offices and grew rich off the sweat of men like them. For Slack, the moral qualms were a luxury he could no longer afford. He agreed. Their first step was to secure the capital. Arnold scraped together what little he had and borrowed more, eventually amassing around $20,000, a substantial sum for the time. He traveled to London and Amsterdam, posing as a buyer for an industrial concern. He was a meticulous student, learning the language of the diamond trade, the different grades and qualities of rough stones. He bought thousands of dollars worth of rough diamonds, mostly low-quality bort. He also purchased a smaller quantity of rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, again of poor quality but visually impressive. He knew that a diversity of gems would make the discovery seem more plausible, a freak of nature's bounty. He packed the stones in canvas bags and smuggled them back to the United States. While Arnold was in Europe, Slack's job was to find the perfect location for their phantom mine. Arnold's instructions were precise. It had to be remote, far from any established mining districts or well-traveled routes. It had to be difficult to access, preferably requiring a long and arduous journey that would discourage casual visitors and make a return trip a major undertaking. And it had to be on land that was not yet surveyed or claimed, a blank spot on the map where their story could be written without contradiction. Slack, ever the plodder, set out from Kentucky in the spring of 1871. He traveled by train to Wyoming,
a territory that was still largely wilderness. From there, he journeyed by horse and pack mule into the vast empty spaces where Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah converged. It was a brutal, lonely landscape of high desert, wind-swept mesas, and deep, shadowy canyons. It was a land that tested a man's resolve, a place where the silence was so profound it felt like a physical weight. For weeks, Slack wandered, following the Green River, talking to Ute tribesmen, and studying the geology. He was looking for a place that felt right, a place that looked the part. He found it in northwestern Colorado, about 70 miles southeast of the nearest settlement, a dusty outpost called Green River Station. It was a flat-topped mountain, or mesa, rising several hundred feet from the surrounding plain. The climb to the top was steep and treacherous, a natural defense against easy access. The top of the mesa was a desolate, wind-swept plateau, a few acres of sparse grass, sagebrush, and anthills commanding a panoramic view of endless, empty wilderness. It was perfect. It was so God-forsakenly remote, so utterly devoid of any mineralogical promise, that no sane prospector would ever have given it a second glance. This, Arnold would later appreciate, was its greatest asset. The sheer unlikeliness of the location would become part of its mystique. Slack marked the spot, cached some supplies, and began the long journey back east to rendezvous with his cousin, carrying in his mind the coordinates of their future kingdom. When they met again in the late summer, the final pieces of the plan fell into place. They would travel west together, carrying their precious cargo of gems. They would spend a few weeks prospecting near their chosen spot, allowing themselves to be seen in nearby settlements to establish their presence in the region. Then they would perform the most critical act of the entire conspiracy, the salting of the mine. In the autumn of 1871, two weathered, unassuming men on horseback, leading a heavily laden pack mule, rode out into the vast emptiness of the American West. They were Philip Arnold and John Slack, and in their saddlebags they carried a fortune not dug from the earth, but destined for it. They found the mesa just as Slack had left it. For several days they worked under the immense silent sky, performing their strange reverse alchemy. It was meticulous, back-breaking labor. Using a stip, they would poke a hole in the top of an anthill and drop in a few stones, a diamond here, a ruby there. They pry open crevices in the rock and wedge gems inside. They dug shallow holes in the sandy soil, dropped in a handful of stones, and carefully covered their tracks. They scattered their treasure over several acres, ensuring that a prospector could find stones almost anywhere they looked. They even dammed a small seasonal stream, planted stones in its bed, and then released the water to wash away their work and give it the appearance of a natural alluvial deposit. They were careful not to overdo it. The gems were not scattered like seeds in a field, but placed with a counterfeiter's artistry. Some were deep, requiring a bit of digging. Others were placed in locations that suggested they had been weathered out of a deeper, unseen source, the mother lode that would fire the imaginations of their future investors. As they worked, they must have felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror. They were two men alone in the wilderness, playing God with a patch of dirt, creating a geological fiction that they hoped would rewrite their lives. When they were finished, the mesa looked exactly as it had before, a barren, wind-swept place of no particular interest. But now it was pregnant with a lie. Their work done, they packed up their gear and rode to San Francisco. They took with them a small pouch of their finest samples, the bait for the trap they were about to set. San Francisco in 1872 was the undisputed capital of the West, a city built on gold and silver, pulsing with a feverish energy. It was a city of instant millionaires and spectacular bankruptcies, where fortunes were made on whispers and rumors, and where the wildest schemes could find a willing audience. The air crackled with speculative frenzy. The city's elite, Men who had clawed their way to the top of the financial heap were perpetually on the hunt for the next big thing, the next Comstock lode that would catapult them into the realm of the truly powerful. It was into this shark tank that Arnold and Slack, two dusty, weather-beaten prospectors, prepared to dangle their glittering bait. Their first move was a masterpiece of calculated caution. They didn't march into the grandest bank in the city and dump their diamonds on the counter. Instead, they sought out a local businessman, George D. Roberts, a man known for his involvement in mining ventures, but not quite in the top echelon of the city's financiers. In January 1872, Arnold and Slack appeared in his office, looking nervous and out of place. They spoke in hushed tones, explaining that they had made a remarkable discovery but were wary of being cheated by powerful men. They showed Roberts a handful of their stones. He was skeptical, as any experienced man would be, but also intrigued. The stones looked real. He advised them to deposit their find in a bank for safekeeping, a step that would lend them an air of legitimacy. Arnold and Slack agreed, but with a performance of great reluctance. They chose the Bank of California, the city's most powerful financial institution, presided over by the charismatic and ferociously ambitious William C. Ralston. Ralston was the uncrowned king of San Francisco, a man who had built an empire on Nevada silver. He was a visionary and a gambler, a man who believed in the limitless potential of the West and was willing to back that belief with millions of dollars. He was precisely the kind of man Arnold was targeting, powerful, respected, and possessed of a gambler's spirit that could sometimes overwhelm his business acumen. When the two prospectors deposited their bag of gems, they insisted on sealing the box themselves and leaving strict instructions that it was not to be opened. This act, of course, had the exact opposite effect. The whispers began immediately. What could be so valuable
that two rough prospectors would take such precautions? The bank officials, their curiosity piqued, notified Ralston. The trap was sprung. Ralston, a man for whom secrecy was a challenge, soon arranged a meeting. He, along with his associate, William M. Lent, and a few other trusted investors, met with Arnold and Slack. The cousins played their roles to perfection. They were cagey, suspicious, and seemingly ignorant of the true value of their find. They spoke of a remote location, a place of incredible hardship, and a ground that was littered with these shiny pebbles. They presented themselves not as businessmen seeking investment, but as simple men terrified of being swindled. This performance was crucial. Had they been slick salesmen, they would have been dismissed. But their apparent naivete made their story all the more believable. The financiers saw them not as equals, but as simpletons who had stumbled upon a treasure they didn't have the sense to exploit. They saw an opportunity. The initial valuation of the sample stones only fanned the flames. The gems were taken to the city's best jewelers, who confirmed that they were indeed real diamonds and rubies of significant value. The news sent a shockwave through the small circle of investors Ralston had gathered. They were sitting on the biggest discovery of the century. The California gold rush would be a footnote by comparison. A syndicate was quickly formed, including some of the most powerful names on the West Coast: Ralston, Lent, Asbury Harpending, a flamboyant and ruthless adventurer financier, and several others. They offered the cousins an initial payment of $50,000 for a share of the discovery, with a promise of a much larger stake in the new company they intended to form. Arnold, feigning suspicion, initially refused. He haggled, he expressed doubts, he spoke of taking his discovery elsewhere. This only made the investors more desperate. They raised their offer, eventually agreeing to a staggering sum of several $100,000 for the majority interest, while allowing Arnold and Slack to retain a smaller share.
The cousins walked away with a fortune in cash and securities, having sold nothing more than a patch of worthless dirt and a brilliantly told story. But the investors were not fools. They were hard-nosed businessmen who had seen their share of scams. Before they invested the millions that would be required to develop the mine, they needed confirmation. They insisted on sending their own trusted mining expert to verify the discovery. This was the moment of greatest risk for Arnold and Slack. Their entire deception now rested on their ability to fool a seasoned professional on his own turf. They agreed, but only on their own strict terms. They would lead the expert to the site, but to protect their secret, he would have to be blindfolded for the final part of the journey. This bizarre condition, rather than raising suspicion, only added to the mystique and the perceived value of the discovery. The man chosen for this critical task was Henry Yonnen, one of the most respected mining engineers in the country. He was a man of impeccable reputation, whose word could make or break a mining venture. If Yonnen confirmed the find, the floodgates of investment would open. In the late spring of 1872, a small expedition set out from a remote rail station in Wyoming. It included Arnold, Slack, Henry Yonnen, and a few of the investors, including the eager Asbury Harpending. The journey was deliberately arduous. Arnold and Slack led them on a circuitous route through a harsh and confusing landscape of badlands and canyons. Days were spent in the saddle, nights under the stars. The physical hardship and the growing sense of anticipation worked on the minds of the investors. They were being led on a quest, a pilgrimage to a secret shrine of wealth. For the final leg of the journey, Yonnen and the others dutifully submitted to being blindfolded. They were led on a twisting path for several hours before the blindfolds were removed. They found themselves on a high, isolated mesa, exactly the kind of improbable location the cousins had described. The scene that followed was pure theater, expertly staged by Arnold and Slack. With a feigned casualness, one of them kicked at an anthill, revealing a sparkle of gems. Yonnen, the seasoned expert, knelt to examine the ground. He dug with his hands and, to his astonishment, found a diamond, then another, and a ruby. For 2 days, the entire party scoured the mesa. Everywhere they looked, they found gems. They emerged from anthills. They were wedged in rock crevices. They lay glinting in the sandy soil. Yonnen, a man of science and method, was overwhelmed by the sheer raw evidence before him. He conducted a few basic tests. He saw that the gems were found in proximity to bedrock, that they seemed to be weathering out from a deeper source. The distribution seemed random, just as one would expect in a natural deposit. The sheer audacity of the fraud was its most effective shield. It never occurred to Yonnen that anyone would go to the trouble of manually salting several acres of remote wilderness with thousands of individual stones. The labor involved seemed superhuman, the cost prohibitive. He concluded, as Arnold had gambled he would, that the discovery was, against all odds, genuine. Upon his return to San Francisco, Henry Yonnen wrote a glowing report. His words were unequivocal. He wrote, "I do not hesitate to say that the discovery is a genuine one," estimating that a team of 10 men could extract $1 million worth of gems per month. The report was like putting a match to a powder keg. With Yonnen's endorsement, all doubt vanished. The new company, the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company, was officially formed with a capitalization of $10 million, an astronomical sum for the era. The news, carefully leaked to the press, caused a nationwide sensation. Headlines screamed of a diamond discovery in the American West. Tiffany & Company in New York City was brought in to examine the stones from the site. Charles Tiffany himself, along with his chief gemologist, inspected the gems and declared them to be of fine quality, worth at least $150,000. Their valuation was honest, but their conclusion was flawed. They were evaluating a bag of pre-selected, salted gems, not a representative sample from a working mine. They had no idea that the bag they held contained nearly the entire value of the mine. The endorsement from the nation's most prestigious jeweler was the final seal of approval. The company's stock soared in value even before it was publicly offered. European investors, including the legendary Baron Rothschild, were clamoring to get in on the action. Arnold and Slack, the two humble prospectors, had hooked the biggest fish in the sea. They collected another huge payment, bringing their total take to nearly $700,000, and quietly faded into the background, leaving the high-flying financiers to manage their non-existent empire.
While the titans of finance celebrated their coup, a different kind of man was reading the newspaper reports with a growing sense of unease. Clarence King was a new breed of scientist, a geologist who believed in rigorous, systematic investigation. He was the head of the U.S. Geological Survey of the 40th Parallel, a massive, federally funded project to map and study the geology of a 100-mile-wide swath of the American West. King was young, brilliant, and fiercely dedicated to the integrity of his profession. He had spent years in the very wilderness where the supposed diamond fields were located. He knew that landscape intimately, its rock formations, its volcanic history, its geological DNA. The stories he was reading didn't add up. The reported association of diamonds and rubies in the same deposit was a geological anomaly, a near impossibility. The descriptions of the location, while vague, placed it squarely within the area his survey had just meticulously mapped. If there had been a geological formation capable of producing diamonds, he and his team would have seen it. The stories smelled wrong, like a prospector's tall tale amplified to a global scale. For King, this was not just a matter of scientific curiosity. The fraud, if that's what it was a direct assault on his life's work. It made a mockery of the careful, painstaking science his team was pioneering. It was an embarrassment to American science and a danger to the public. He felt a professional and patriotic duty to investigate. He gathered his top men, geologists Samuel Emmons and James Gardner. In the late autumn of 1872, as the investors in San Francisco were planning their first lavish mining expedition for the following spring, King and his team set out from Fort Bridger in Wyoming. It was a race against time. Winter was setting in, and they knew the high country would soon be impassable. They had only a general idea of the mine's location, pieced together from newspaper accounts and rumors. They knew it was near a mountain called the Table Rock, in the vicinity of the Vermilion Cliffs. Their journey was brutal. The weather turned against them with biting winds and heavy snows. They were not guided by the perpetrators, but were hunting for a secret location in a vast and hostile wilderness. For weeks they searched, their supplies dwindling and the morale of their men sinking. They were on the verge of giving up, of admitting defeat to the winter and the enormity of the landscape. Then, a stroke of luck. They stumbled upon a man who had been hired as a cook for Yanin's expedition. He only had a vague memory of the route, but he remembered a particular fork in a trail and a distinctive landmark. It was the clue King needed. Following the faint trail, they finally arrived at the mesa. The scene was just as described, an isolated, wind-swept plateau. At first, they found nothing. The land was barren, the ground frozen, but King was a patient, methodical observer. He instructed his men to spread out and search. It was James Gardner who found the first piece of evidence. Not a diamond, but a small hole in the side of an anthill, a hole that looked unnaturally precise. Then another man found a diamond sitting on the surface, its position betraying no connection to the soil beneath it. Then came the moment of chilling discovery that confirmed King's suspicions. One of his men picked up a diamond and yelled out in excitement, "King, hurry over!" He took the stone and examined it closely. He saw something that the jewelers and mining experts, in their greed-fueled haste, had missed. On one of the facets of the rough diamond was a tiny, telltale mark, the mark of a gem cutter's tool. It was a clear sign that the stone had been shaped by human hands, not by nature. A natural diamond weathered from the earth would show no such mark. The spell was broken. Suddenly, they saw the fraud everywhere. They found a ruby that showed similar tool marks. They discovered that the gems were found only in the loose topsoil, never in the underlying bedrock. They began digging a trench, and within a few feet they had passed completely through the gem-bearing layer into sterile virgin earth. The deposit had no depth, no source. It was a shallow, superficial sham. King found a crevice in a rock with a dozen diamonds crammed into it, a placement so unnatural it was laughable. The most damning evidence came when James Gardner dug up an anthill and found, to his astonishment, 12 diamonds in a neat little pile. He famously remarked that it was a generous ant. The anthills, which had so convinced the earlier party, were revealed to be the fraud's most clumsy feature. King and his team had all the evidence they needed. They were cold, exhausted, and hungry, but they rode with a sense of urgent purpose back to the nearest rail station. From there, King took a train directly to San Francisco. He arrived in late November and walked unannounced into the offices of the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company. He was met by William Ralston and the other directors. They were on top of the world, finalizing plans and dreaming of their future wealth. King, a dusty, travel-worn geologist, calmly and methodically presented his findings. He explained the geology of the region. He described the tool marks on the stones, the shallow nature of the deposit, the absurd concentration of gems in the anthills. He laid out the cold, hard scientific facts that proved their million-dollar enterprise was a complete and utter fraud. The reaction was a storm of disbelief, denial, and finally dawning horror. They were powerful men, not used to being told they were wrong, let alone that they had been made fools of by a pair of backwoods prospectors. They summoned Henry Yonan, their expert, who was aghast at King's evidence. How could he have missed it? The truth was, he had been caught up in the fever, his professional judgment clouded by the sheer spectacle and the overwhelming desire for the discovery to be real. To put the final nail in the coffin, the investors dispatched a new team, which included Yonan, to the site. They returned within a few weeks, their faces grim. King was right. Everything he had said was true. The mine was a hoax. On November 27, 1972, the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company published a notice in the city's newspapers officially declaring their enterprise to be utterly valueless. The news exploded across the country. The Great American Diamond Mine was a fraud. The stock of the company, which had been a ticket to riches just days before, was now worthless paper. The investors had lost everything they put in, over $1 million in cash, expenses, and their own reputations. They were the laughingstock of the nation. William Ralston, the king of San Francisco, had been publicly humiliated, his Midas touch revealed to be all too fallible. Asbury Harpending, the swashbuckling financier, wrote in his memoirs years later that the affair had left him a beggar. The Great Diamond hoax was over.
And what of the architects of the fraud? Philip Arnold, the cunning mastermind, had taken his money and returned to his native Elizabethtown, Kentucky. He became the town's richest and most powerful citizen. He bought a bank, a sprawling estate, and lived the life of a country squire he had always craved. When the news of the hoax broke, he was defiant. He claimed he had been duped himself, that the fields had been salted by others to discredit him. But the evidence was overwhelming. He was eventually sued by the investors and arrested. He settled out of court, returning a portion of his ill-gotten gains, but managed to hold on to a significant fortune. His victory, however, was short-lived. He became embroiled in a bitter feud with a rival banker, a conflict that escalated into a full-blown street war. In 1879, Arnold was shot and seriously wounded by his rival.
He survived the initial attack, but died of complications from pneumonia a few months later. His violent end was a fittingly dramatic conclusion to a life built on audacity and deception. John Slack, the quiet, loyal partner, simply vanished. After collecting his share of the money, he sold his remaining interest in the mine for a small sum and disappeared from the historical record. Rumors placed him in Texas or New Mexico, living out his days as a simple farmer or rancher, the quiet life he had always wanted, financed by one of the most brazen lies in American history. He was never brought to justice, fading back into the obscurity from which he had briefly and spectacularly emerged. Clarence King, the hero of the story, became a national celebrity. He was lauded for his integrity, his scientific rigor, and his courage in exposing the fraud. The incident solidified the reputation of the newly formed U.S. Geological Survey and established its role as an honest broker of scientific truth in an age of rampant speculation. King's actions saved countless smaller investors from ruin and brought a much-needed dose of reality to the fever dreams of the Gilded Age. The Great Diamond Hoax remains a cautionary tale, a story that is both absurdly comical and deeply revealing of its time. It was a fraud that could only have succeeded in a specific moment in American history, a time of vast, uncharted territories, of dizzying economic expansion, and of a deep-seated cultural belief that anyone with a little bit of luck and grit could strike it rich overnight. Philip Arnold and John Slack did not just salt a remote mesa with cheap gems, they salted the very imagination of a nation. They understood, with a genius's insight, that the most valuable commodity in Gilded Age America was not gold or silver or even diamonds, but the dream of infinite, effortless wealth. They sold that dream, and for a brief, shining moment, the most powerful men in the country bought it, hook, line, and sinker. The anthills of Colorado stood as a silent, glittering monument to a time when the line between a colossal fortune and a colossal lie was as thin as a shard of glass and just as easy to see through if one only knew where to look.